We're going to delve now into some global research on how cities grow and the impact of the rural-urban boundary on that growth. So how do you best make room for urban expansion? We're going to have a live link now with Professor of City Planning at the Marron Institute of Urban Management at NYU, Solly Angel. Solly, come in.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can.
We can?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Thank you. Honorable ministers, Deputy Mayor, honorable guests, it's a great pleasure for me to be here to talk to you. This is going to be a little bit different than the talks that preceded me. It's going to be a kind of a general overview of global urban expansion. And it's interesting to give this talk in Auckland, which is unique in being an outlier in the urban expansion story. So we'll be able to see and compare how Auckland is doing vis-a-vis other cities in the world. Next slide. I want to start by showing you the dimensions of urban expansion. This is Paris, and between the time of Napoleon in 1800 and today, Paris, the population of Paris increased 22-fold. The area of Paris increased 220-fold. And this is common. And we will see it in other cities, but this gives you kind of a very broad perspective of global urban expansion. You can see many more of those historical expansions on the internet. Next slide. My lecture is going to be divided into three. I don't have much time. The first part is going to talk about the dimensions of global urban expansion. The second is going to talk about kind of the global decline in the quality of urban footprints in the last 25 years. So instead of doing better, we're actually doing worse as time goes by. And the third, I'm going to kind of annotate a program for making room for urban expansion. Next slide. It's the first part. This is the results that I'll present now are based on, next slide, on research that we've been doing globally in all the cities in the world. So in 2010, there were 4,231 cities in the world, and we have that had more than 100,000 people, and we have attempted to study all of them. Just as a note, next slide, we conceive of a city as its physical boundary, not as its municipal boundary. You can see here a slide of São Paulo. It is over 31 municipalities. The idea there is the contiguous built-up area, what the Romans called extrema urbanum, is what we conceive to be the city. And the reason we're doing that, and this is very important for the discussion that's going on, is in the modern cities have metropolitan labor markets. They have people working and living everywhere in the city. It's not like in the old days where people worked in the center and lived on the periphery. People are now living and working everywhere, as the two slides, the two cities that you're seeing above are showing. This is Chicago on the left, Los Angeles and Atlanta, and you can see that they all have people living everywhere and working everywhere. In fact, in American cities, according to our research, only 15% of the jobs are now in central cities, and 85% of the jobs are distributed everywhere else in the city. Next slide. And when we talk about metropolitan labor markets, we're talking about the entire metropolis being a labor market so that firms can get workers from everywhere and workers can find work everywhere. This is the kind of thing that drives our idea of metropolitan policy, or metropolitan transportation policy. It's all about facilitating movement in order to increase the productivity and the inclusiveness of cities. Here you see all the software establishment in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you see that Silicon Valley is not really a valley. The entire metropolitan area is part of that high-tech economy in San Francisco. Of course, we cannot study all the cities in the world, so we've decided to focus on a sample of cities. Next slide. A sample of 200 cities, Auckland being one of them, and to study the way that they've expanded during the last 25 years, between 1990 and 2014-15. Next slide. The way that we do this is by looking at satellite imagery, translating that satellite imagery into urban and suburban areas, and then trying to figure out the urban extent of cities. Next slide. Once we figure out the urban extent, we can, for the first time, begin to see what areas were developed before and what areas were developed at the later date. So we are able, for the first time, to see this is the area that was developed before 1990, this is the area that was developed to 2000, this is the area that was developed 2014, and begin to see whether they are different from each other in character. What the slide that you see here is Addis Ababa and how it has expanded over the last 25 years. To look at the quality of the urban environment, we look at high-resolution imagery, at satellite imagery of the Google Earth type or the big type, where we focus on 10-hectare locales and look at what is happening within these locales, and we choose these locales at random. So what you see on that slide are the random locations of locale, again, in Addis Ababa. What do we find when we look at urban expansion? We find that during the last 25 years, there was enormous urban expansion in the world. The median urban expansion is cities have expanded almost 2.5 times. 37% of the cities did not double their size. In fact, you can see Auckland on the left, it only increased its area by 1.18. And of the 200 cities in the sample, it's actually the third lowest in terms of global urban expansion. We can see that like 63% of the cities more than double their size, and 28% of the cities in the sample more than quadruple their size. So urban expansion globally is vast. And when you live in Auckland, of course, you don't see it, but there are many cities that have increased their area 10 times or more, and we're going to see more of that in coming years. Next slide. As I told you about Paris, urban expansion usually proceeds at a faster rate than urban population growth. When you look at Accra, for example, which is shown on this slide, between 1990 and 2014, it has increased its population by a factor of 3.4. Its area has increased by a factor of 6.5. And this is not far from the way that many other cities have developed. So what happens when city expand at a faster rate than population growth is their densities increase. You know, of course, there's a great variation in densities between cities, so if people don't understand, they call the same thing a city when it's very low density and it's very high density. We have cities in the sample from 7 persons per hectare to 372 persons per hectare. Again, Auckland is shown as having very low density in global terms. So there is development and there is very low density development in comparison with other cities in the world. Next slide. Now, generally speaking, as I told you before, urban expansion is taking place faster than urban population growth, which means that densities are declining. What you're seeing here in this slide is the kind of the decline in density in the sample of cities. Globally, densities have declined about 1.4% per year in the cities in the sample. Again, in 40 cities in the sample, the one that are showed on the right side of the slide, densities have increased, and Auckland is among them. The average density, the increase in the 40 cities where density have increased is 1.1% per year, and this is the rate at which density is increasing in Auckland as well. Now, when we ask ourselves why, what can explain the next slide? And then next slide. What can explain the difference in urban extent between cities? And of course, there are two things that explain that difference. One is population, and the other one is income. Cities with greater populations have greater urban extents, as is shown here. In fact, when we look at the entire sample, if you double the population of a city, its extent increases by 80%. It doesn't double, but it increases by 80%. Next slide. However, if you double the income of a city, typically its extent increases by another 55%. So we see that generally cities that are richer occupy more space. Next slide. When we look at a comparison between Lagos and Paris, in 2015, they had approximately the same population, about 11 million people. But Paris had 10 times the GDP per capita that Lagos had, and as a result, as you can see in the slide, Paris was 3.5 times greater in area than Lagos. Now, when we're looking at where we have to worry about urban expansion, it's actually not in the cities in the more developed countries and not in places like Europe or Japan, and particularly not Eastern Europe, which is declining in urban population. The US is still growing in urban population, and some cities like Auckland are still growing at 1.8, 2% per year. These cities will, of course, expand. They will also densify. Some of the development will take place on brownfields, some on greenfields. The balance is a policy question. But we have to understand that most of the urbanization is going to take place in less developed countries. In fact, between 2015 and 2050, for every person that will be added to cities in the more developed countries, 18 people will be added to cities in the less developed countries. Next slide. So generally what we're going to see in the next 35 years, on average, cities in the less developed countries are going to triple in size. Cities in the more developed countries are going to increase their size by about 90%. Next. Let me now turn to the quality of the urban footprints and the change in that quality. What we're seeing is that the share of the streets, for example, that are less than 4 meters wide is increasing over time. So it was 28% in the areas built before 1990. It is 20% in the areas built before 1990. It's now 28%. So now we're getting more narrow roads than we got before. Another thing that is happening, next slide, that is affecting walkability is that average block size is increasing, making it more difficult to walk, more difficult to bicycle. So average block size in areas built before 1990 was 3.7 hectares. It's now, in the new areas, it's 5.4 hectares. This goes hand in hand, next slide, with the reduced share of four-way intersections. So four-way intersections are now less of a share of intersections than they were before. Next slide. The walking distance from arterial roads is also growing over time. What we see is, instead of an infrastructure grid of arterial roads in the expansion areas, we see less arterial roads spaced further apart. Next slide. What we see is that the areas that are not laid out before they're occupied are increasing. Again, the share is increasing from 22% to 31%. And we know that if you don't lay it out, laying it out later may cost 3 to 6 times more than laying it out in advance. Next slide. The share of informal settlements, what you see here is Ulaanbaatar, for example, is increasing rapidly from 17% before 1990 to 29% after 1990. And the share, next slide, of gridded areas is declining to almost nothing in expansion areas. The slide that you see here is one that I like very much. It's a squatter settlement on the periphery of Lima that was laid out when it was invaded by radical priests helped by students from the engineering university in Lima. They laid it out. As a result, it has quickly shed the slum designation. Houses there now cost $180,000 or more. It has one of the quickest increases in real estate prices in all the communities in Lima. So layout makes a huge difference. And this is what I want to talk about in the third part of the lecture, which is making room for urban expansion. We are working at NYU on helping rapidly growing cities prepare for their expansion. We are also helping prepare for densification, but now today I'm only going to talk about expansion. We have in mind a simple four-point program, and I was happy to hear from the minister earlier that the horizon for planning transport is a 30-year horizon. This is what we believe to be the right horizon for urban expansion, and we believe that we should now identify how much land is the city going to need in the next 30 years, because that's the kind of horizon that is needed to plan properly and to develop in advance of both formal and informal developers that are now doing most of the action on the urban periphery. So first, find out how much land you're going to need and prepare 30 years of those lands. What do we mean by prepare? We only mean two main things, and that is prepare an infrastructure grid, say 1 kilometer apart, 30-meter wide roads that we carry public transport and trunk infrastructure throughout the expansion area, and get the right-of-way for that grid now. Never mind actually constructing it, but getting that right-of-way now is infinitely cheaper than getting it after development has gone into these areas. And when you're talking about urban expansion in the Auckland context, I'm not talking about the expansion of Auckland, but I'm talking about the economy, the metropolitan economy of the Auckland and its surrounding cities, and the need to connect them all with transport, and we've seen some of the plans for that. So the arterial grid is the second part. The third part is the protection of environmentally sensitive open spaces and public open spaces from development, so that when development gets there, we have a hierarchy of open spaces. And finally, improving the land subdivision process. Teaching informal developers how to subdivide land better, changing regulations to allow for them to participate in the land subdivision process, making them maybe semi-legal or starting to make them a little bit more legal. These are the 4 parts. Let me just now give you a very short progress report on what we're doing on the ground. We have a program in Ethiopia that started out with 4 cities and has now extended to 14 more, where we are employing that 4-point program. Next slide. These municipalities are surveying the arterial road network, and what you see on the left is a surveyor in a squatter settlement preparing, measuring where the arterial road is going to be. And on the right, if you see on the door there's an arrow. That's where the people have to clear the arterial road to that arrow, and they've done that. And next slide. We can see that in some of these cities, they've already made room for like 62 kilometers of road. And this is a place like Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries in Africa, but they have found this idea of preparing road grids as the kind of the basis for their expansion very useful. Next slide. The next program is a program in Colombia where we have a similar initiative that started in 4 cities, and we have now actually expanded it to 109 cities in Colombia, instructing these cities on how to prepare for expansion. The next slide will show the expansion plan for Monteria, where you can see the 30-year area plus the 1 kilometer grid that has been designated there. The next slide is that what we're doing now is we're getting liens on the property titles of where the arterial roads are going to go. Next slide. And we are planting trees along the future sidewalks of these arterial roads. So in both the Monteria and Valledupar, 2 cities in Colombia, there are nurseries with 15,000 trees that are in the next couple of months are going to be planted along the future arterial roads. And this is the way of kind of preparing these cities for their expansion. Thank you very much.